journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm David Reed. This is the time of year when conservatives complain that there's a war on Christmas in America. It's true that more people and more retailers are using the word holiday in place of Christmas. Really, though, the constitutional separation of church and state is often under attack here. But at least Christians and Muslims and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists aren't killing one another in the name of religion, which is happening more and more in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Tom Heneghan spent 25 years working for Reuters when he reported from 30 countries. He now directs the news agency's coverage of religion internationally. He's joining us by telephone from Paris to talk about the dynamics in reporting on religion. Here in the studio, to add a scholarly perspective, is Debra Mason. She directs the Center on Religion and the Professions, and that's housed here at the University of Missouri in the School of Journalism. And she is also executive director of the Religion Newswriters Association, and her group puts out the Religion News Services, which is sort of similar to what Reuters does on a more specific basis. I wanted to welcome you both to Global Journalist.
Thank you.
Now,
Thank you.
In Italy this spring, the journalists from around the world gathered to form the International Association of Religion Journalists, another group similar to yours. And the group's co-chair, Rachel Cohn of Australia, said that one of the reasons they're forming was that so many of the ongoing conflicts around the world today have what she called a religious factor. And she said the association can help journalism promote understanding that can help reduce conflicts. But in general, are journalists meeting that objective, Tom, or does the media tend to inflame conflict?
Both. You know, it really depends. It depends on which conflict you're talking about, which newspapers, which journalists you're talking about. It's such a wide variety. For example, you can get somebody who knows the background, knows the local language, and is aware of all the subtleties, and standing right next to him or her can be a rookie who's just taken off the desk somewhere and sent as a fireman out to the same conflict. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I've seen that myself, and I was a rookie at one point too. So it's very hard to say. I think one problem that we have is that, of course, the media always has to give a concise report, and you have to boil things down to their essentials. And religion is very often more complicated than politics. It's got one or more extra dimensions to it. That makes it very difficult.
What are those extra dimensions?
Well, just take a hypothetical case of two countries that are fighting over land. If it's just a question of fighting over land because there's water in one country and the other country is trying to get it, or there are raw materials. Take a look at some of the fighting in Africa, like in the Great Lakes area there. That's about raw materials that they're going after. But if you then look at Israel and Palestine, it's not only land, because at least on the Israeli side, you have people who say, wait a minute, in the Bible, God gave us this land, and that's a completely different dimension. And you go to Israel, and you find some people who argue that way in a very hardline way, others who tend towards that but may not be so strong about it, others who don't use that argument at all. So you really have to know what you're talking about when you get on the ground there.
Right, and Deborah, what would your comments be on that?
Right, and Tom's absolutely right, and I would agree that. So what you've got in just those particular examples are you have history that is informing what's going on among the peoples in that area. You have interpretations of sacred scriptures, and that's always gets incredibly complicated. And as Tom pointed out, the vast majority of people who are writing about religion don't do it on a regular basis and don't have a lot of knowledge about some of the more complex and the contextual elements to those stories.
Right. And just to put a broad context on this discussion, Tom, is religious persecution becoming more prevalent around the world now than when you first started doing this job, and maybe when you first started at Reuters?
Yeah, I think it is, and I think, there's also the phenomenon of which we're hearing about these things more and more, but I think there is a trend towards more religious persecution and religious violence because you have fundamentalisms, for lack of a better word, in all religions. And I think it's an effect of globalization. You have countries that before were isolated, they had to live with their neighbors, and so they sort of got along with them. There might have been fights now and then. But then through globalization, they see that, for example, Muslims and Jews are fighting each other in the Holy Land. So off in Pakistan, where I was correspondent a long time ago, this would then start to play into the situation there. There were almost no Jews there, but there would be an anti-Semitism that they were getting because they were connecting to some other conflict. I think that's happening in many different ways in many different parts of the world.
And Debra, you've studied this over a really long period of time.
Right.
So can you give us the really quick?
Well, there has always been religious conflict, but I think, as Tom pointed out, the globalization has directly had a direct impact, and particularly religious organizations are using the media quite effectively. And now with anybody being able to be a publisher and the use of social media particularly, there was a recent study that came out that showed that particularly in predominantly Arab countries, the use of social media to talk about religion is at about 60% among the population compared to an average of about 14%. So we're seeing the use of this, and what it can do is foment that those conflicts. It can, allow the public to become more passionate about certain religious viewpoints, and I think it is going to continue and probably grow.
But isn't both of your jobs to educate people? Usually, ignorance is part of the cause of conflict, right?
Absolutely.
And so it would seem that having more information out there potentially could be a benefit. But you're saying it cuts both ways, Tom?
Yes, very much so, because people find out about these conflicts elsewhere, or they get new arguments. They might already have a certain animosity towards another group, and they will find an argument on the internet or get it over satellite TV. Even here in France, we're not just talking about developing countries or poor areas of the world. Even here in France, when there was the Intifada on the West Bank in Gaza, some Muslim kids here started playing Intifada in the poor suburbs of Paris and started harassing Jewish pupils at school. There would be a Jewish school, and they started harassing the kids, and they were playing it out. So it's a problem, and it will only get worse, I think.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to just add that I think tied to this is this issue of religious freedom. And you can't talk about, for instance, freedom of the press or freedom of speech without including freedom of religion. And what we find is that across the globe, in places where you have democratic countries that have freedom of speech and pair it also with freedom of religion, then the media is not inhibited, or there's no chilling effect to report and write about religion. But in countries where, even countries that, like Egypt, for instance, which is, espousing supposedly freedom of speech in its constitution, it also in the new constitution talks about religious blasphemy and prohibitions against that. Well, this makes it extremely difficult for journalists seeking to write about diverse faiths or diverse viewpoints about religion to do that in a way without being threatened with imprisonment or torture or so on.
Right.
There's another problem there, and that there's the gap between theory and reality. For example, what the Egyptian constitution will finally say will be one thing. What happens on the ground could be something quite different. And so there could be a tradition and custom on the ground which will not match the laws, and the laws are not always enforced.
Right. Tom, I wanted to go back just briefly to your comment about the children in France and the indoctrination. I wanted to talk about what's happened since 9/11. I think that seems to be somewhat of a benchmark. The terrorist attacks in the United States. Right after that, you were sent to Pakistan along with some other journalists from Reuters, just to get kind of a feel for what was happening out there and what the root of these feelings were. And you tell us a bit about that experience.
Well, I went out because I was correspondent in Pakistan and Afghanistan in the mid-'80s. And so after 9/11, the editors put out a call to all the old Pakistan hands and said, you want to go back? Mm-hmm. And I jumped at it, of course. And so I went out first for 6 weeks, and then came back, and then went out again a few weeks later, went out for another 6 weeks. What I found, it was very interesting because between the time I'd left in 1986 and when I got back there in 2001, the Islamization of Pakistan, the very visible and political presence of Islam, rather than just the traditional presence that I knew, had really picked up. You saw many more women who were veiled. You saw full facial veils and niqab, which you never saw before. Many more men wearing beards and dressed as Salafis. And so I could see that a polarization had taken place already. Mm-hmm. And then 9/11, what that did, that's where you see the effect of globalization. That news went around the world in a flash, and the scenes of the planes going into the Twin Towers and all of this went in. And for Pakistanis, they say, oh, these are Muslims attacking a Christian country. And they immediately see Western countries as Christian countries. Then when the bombing started, the U.S.-led coalition that was fighting to oust the Taliban, they were saying, well, Christians are attacking Muslims. And there were banners in the streets in Islamabad saying Salibi Jung, the crusade has started, and basically inciting people to go out and attack Christians, which soon happened. There were, I remember several Protestants were killed in a firebomb in a Protestant church outside of Islamabad, and down in Punjab there were other Christian churches were attacked and more people were killed. And all of this was stoked by those images and by this idea, this identification that goes across borders. So it wasn't any more Pakistanis, it was Muslims, period. Muslims versus Christians. And
since you have a pretty thorough blog and you run the Reuters Interfaith blog, so you're very much on top of what's happening with conflicts in religion. So what's your opinion now about how in Pakistan and Afghanistan, in that area, whether things have gotten better since that trip or worse?
Worse, much worse. No, it's very worrying out there because there's a minority, and it's a small minority, but there's a minority of Taliban. They go under several different names, but some of them are called Taliban, in this case Salafis. They are hardline Muslims who think that they have the right to kill even other Muslims if they don't follow the strictest interpretation of Islam possible, the one that they are offering. And it's partly religious and partly political. Some of these Taliban are working hand in hand with drug smugglers, drug dealers and smugglers. Others, the Taliban in Afghanistan, are also Pashtun nationalists. They defend the interests of the East and the South against the Northerners who are Persian-speaking. So it's very complicated, but since there's no effective government in Pakistan, the government is very weak, these people rule the roost. They killed the governor of Punjab, who I knew. They killed the minister for minority affairs, who was a Christian. And they attack especially Shiite and Sufi mosques because they consider them heretics. They attack them at will. Foreign journalists in the country don't even report that many of them anymore because it's like the daily weather report, how many of these mosques are attacked. So it's very bad out there.
And Debra, in your curation of religious news from around the world, would you agree?
I would agree, but I would also say that it's not just Muslims versus Muslim violence and restrictions and control. It's also Christian versus Muslim. It's Hindu versus Buddhist. It's Buddhist versus atheists. It's Protestant.
Countries, sure.
Right, Protestantism versus Catholicism. And in, for instance, South America, it's certainly not as violent, but there are really growing religious tensions Christians in many parts of the developing world, particularly, but not just the developing world. And we see it in Western countries as well, with immigration of people of diverse faiths, and those Western nations trying to adapt and figure out ways to adhere to religious freedoms while also protecting the rights of those who are in that country from the beginning.
At the same time, there are some very good initiatives to promote interfaith understanding, and I cover those. I try to cover that as much as I can, because I think the world is not only made up of the conflicts, and especially if we're reporting about religion, there is a positive side that should be brought out.
Yeah, tell us about that Saudi-backed center that opened or started work this month.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, because after Pope Benedict gave his speech in Regensburg in 2006, where he was a bit clumsy in the way he spoke about Islam, and he used a quote that was negative about Islam, and he said later he was just using that quote as an illustration, but that set off demonstrations in many Muslim countries. There were several attempts to build bridges after that, and one of them came from the Saudis, who, as an Israeli rabbi at the center said to me, are the hardline heartland of Islam.
Right.
The Saudis really are very, very conservative, and most Saudis don't want to have anything to do with interreligious dialogue like that. They think, what we have is fine, thank you very much. But the Saudi king, in his own way, is a reformer. It's a very cautious reform. He can't move very, very quickly. So he started, back in 2008, he held a conference on interfaith dialogue in Madrid. He couldn't hold it in Saudi Arabia. It wouldn't be allowed. And he certainly couldn't have Jews attend it. But he did it in Madrid. And then he kept on pursuing this. And he said, we have to have some continuation of this dialogue. And out of that meeting came the idea that they should set up a center. Again, it would have to be outside of Saudi Arabia. But they picked Vienna as a nice neutral place. They have a 9-member board of directors, 3 Muslims, 3 Christians, a Jew, a Hindu, and a Buddhist.
Wow, I didn't know this.
And they're the ones who run it. The Saudis are paying for the first 3 years. They bought the beautiful little building right on one of the main boulevards in Vienna and refurbished it, and they're going to pay the budget for the first 3 years. But it's the board of directors that has the final say on what they do. And one of the things that they'll do is bring Saudi imams to Vienna to meet Christian priests and meet rabbis and meet Buddhists and Hindus, and get them used to the idea that you can talk to people from other religions, and it can be a pleasant experience. Even you're not going to be robbed or whatever. You walk away, okay. And so they also have programs that they want to do, joint programs, for example, getting religious leaders involved in promoting child health care, mostly in Africa. And that's also a problem, because it's usually the Muslim radicals, the Islamists, who are against, for example, polio vaccination programs. So it's good to get local imams to convince people that they should have their children vaccinated. That happens already, but of course this will give it more impetus, because you have the Saudis are behind it, and that means prestige and money.
Right, Deborah, I wanted to hear your opinion on the significance of this Saudi-backed initiative.
Right, and there have been Saudi-backed center. There is a Saudi-backed center here at Georgetown University in the United States, and where there's I think they've given at least $20 million to help work on that specifically works on relationships between Christians and Muslims. But I think we are seeing a growing, when you say the word interfaith, most people see that as ineffective, but I think people are understanding that this is vital to the future of our globe and to helping to reduce religious conflict. And I think that the media is starting to understand that there are effective models are starting to be developed, and that we have a responsibility also to not just ignore these as ineffective, but also report on them as well.
Okay.
I had an a senior official in a Middle Eastern country, an Arab country, told me one time that the protecting the Christian minority in his country, which was a tiny percentage, was a question of national security. Mm-hmm. And I was stunned when I heard that. Right. But it was true, because he said, we need to have peace. We can't let people fight with each other, because then the different Muslim groups in his country would start fighting more against each other. Right. So he said it's good to have a Christian minority, and we have to protect them for our own national security.
Well, I want to move the discussion a bit to the United States just for a bit. But before we continue our discussion, I want to remind everyone that you can view or listen to this program anytime by downloading our podcasts at globaljournalist.org. You can also find interesting articles, photos, and interviews related to our program on our website. So please send us questions or comments via globaljournalist@kbia.org or our Facebook page. You can also follow us on Twitter at globaljourn. Now, I'm wondering if journalists from the United States can really be unbiased when reporting on religion. After all, stamped on every dollar bill is the "In God We Trust" that's ingrained in our culture. After the 9/11 attacks, the "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" song that was usually played during the seventh inning stretch was replaced by "God Bless America," and it's kind of an example of U.S. exceptionalism. So, do you think that? I'll start with Debra. That the religious reporting in the United States has been affected by these trends?
Well, religion reporting has been affected by various trends, mostly related to economics and business. So the religion beat has been a victim of cuts in newsrooms. And so that brings fewer voices who are experts on covering religion within the U.S. media in a broad general circulation media that I'm talking about. But, it's funny because when you have somebody covering politics, typically, if you're interviewing somebody for a political beat, you don't ask them, are you Republican or are you Democrat? Mm-hmm. And so it's always interesting to me that people have that question about religion. I think the key is professional values, professional journalistic values. Mm-hmm. And the way I teach religion reporting and writing is I tell students, I say it can be done. We're not out to prove a religion right or wrong. We're serving a watchdog function to organizations that get significant money and have significant power over individuals. We're there to tell stories, not just conflict stories, but positive stories, for instance, faith-based outreach in times of disasters and things like that. But if your personal faith gives you blinders and you recognize that as a professional journalist, then you shouldn't be writing about religion. Mm-hmm. Find something else. And that's how I try to counsel. But, all across the globe, Tom is an example at Reuters, and all across the globe you have journalists who are really spectacular at what they do. They're fundamentally wonderful storytellers. Religion is wonderful. It's colorful. It has lots of elements that make it fascinating to write about. And they do it, and I've known people for decades and never known what their own personal faith beliefs are. And
Tom, from your perspective across the pond, so to speak, you've viewed how the U.S. is portraying religious issues. What do you think that it's getting worse since there's few religion beat reporters and writers, or is it about?
Well, let me say first that I don't think it's a philosophical argument. Can there be real objectivity in journalism? I don't think there can be. You can be as professional as you can, and we all try to be as professional as we can. But we're obviously marked by our origins, So, for example, being an American and going around to different countries and different cultures, covering different religions, I first noticed when I started doing this about 10 years ago that I had certain assumptions about the way a religion is organized. It's very interesting. If you grew up in a Western country with a Christian tradition, even if it's not very religious anymore, you think religions have a leader and a certain hierarchy and a certain connection between the church buildings and there's a center and things. It's very often not the case at all in Islam. Islam is much more decentralized, so you have to learn that. But I found that because there is so much freedom of religion in the States, and people know that abroad, I think I get a better reception from some, especially in Muslim countries. They'll say, "Oh, you understand religion in public." Then, for example, my French colleagues, who very often they'll say, "Oh, you French you don't like religion in public, so you won't understand what we're talking about."
Mm-hmm. And we have about a minute left, so I wanted to Tom, wanted to get your last comment on where this is going. What can be done to reduce the religious aspect to conflict, and do you think it's going to continue to get worse?
Well, information, education is the answer in the long term. But what can we do in the short term? I always try to, when I look at a conflict, if I go to a country for the first time, I say, I'm bound to notice all the religious parts. Let me find out what's not religious about this conflict. Mm-hmm. And then try to disentangle. Of course, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to disentangle the religion from the political, from the economic. But I always try to at least get an idea of that. Okay, well, I think we'll have to leave it there. We've come to the end of this week's edition of Global Journalist. Joining us today were Professor Debra Mason and Tom Heneghan of Reuters. Our program is produced by the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Our program is directed by Travis McMillan. Audio by Pat Akers. Raymond Tengakar is our executive producer. Servani Pear was our lead producer, assisted by Raven Murrah and Taylor DeHaze. Stay with us for a special edition of Free Press Watch, and join us again next week for another Global Journalist. I'm David Reed.
Hello, I'm Gina Cook. It's now time for your weekly Free Press Watch, a segment on Global Journalist where we bring you a rundown of major events affecting press freedom around the world. Today's news is from the Committee to Protect Journalists, Journalists in Danger, and Somaliland Press. 2 TV journalists in the Democratic Republic of Congo were jailed for criticizing the Bandundu Provincial Assembly president in a broadcast. Reporters Without Borders says the frequency of these arrests is on the rise. Journalists in Danger, an African free press organization, called for the release of the 2 reporters. Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed says the country will establish a task force to investigate the killings of journalists. The announcement comes after at least 12 Somali journalists were killed on the job. Somalia ranks second on the Committee to Protect Journalists Impunity Index. The index contains information about the unsolved murders of journalists around the world. The Committee to Protect Journalists announced the number of imprisoned reporters reached a record high this year. CPJ reports 232 journalists are behind bars, which exceeds last year's count by 53. Anti-state charges such as terrorism or treason were the most common allegations against journalists in 2012. You can find more about these and other events affecting press freedom around the world at globaljournalist.org. Thanks for joining us for Free Press Watch. I'm Gina Cook.